Prologue. The night. Everything changed. Portland, Oregon, August 19th, 1995. The amber glow of late summer hung over Lake Hayden like a held breath. The air was thick with the smell of pine and honeysuckle, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the lake water that lapped gently against the weathered dock. Along the curved shoreline, just beyond the reach of the towering Douglas firs, the Wilson estate sprawled in quiet elegance. A two-story colonial revival painted in cream and cobalt, its wide wraparound porch festooned with ivy and glowing string lights that swayed in the evening breeze. Inside, laughter spilled through the open French doors, mingling with the clink of champagne flutes and the slow, sultry pulse of a jazz quartet. The reception for Emily Wilson's wedding had reached that hazy, golden stage where toasts grow sentimental, ties are loosened, and guests drift between the dance floor and the lakeside patio, their voices blurring into a warm hum of celebration. Emily Wilson, 26, radiant in a silk gown that caught the light with every movement, glided through the crowd like a bride in a dream. Her veil trailed over polished hardwood floors, still damp from dancing, and her face glowed with the kind of happiness that photographs can never quite capture. Her new husband, Daniel Hayes, stood beside the makeshift bar, laughing with groomsmen and stealing glances at his wife, his tie already loosened, his face flushed with wine and joy. Everything was perfect, almost, because at the far end of the estate, standing alone on the wooden pier that jutted into the black water, was Karen Wilson, 52, Emily's mother, and the woman who had paid for every detail of this day. She wore a burgundy dress that shimmered when she moved, but tonight she barely moved at all. She just stood there, one hand resting on the railing, the other holding a cigarette she'd borrowed from a waiter. The smoke curled upward into the darkening sky, disappearing into the canopy of stars. On her feet were burgundy heels, custom-dyed to match the dress. Italian leather, size 7. Karen had bought them specifically for this day, had them shipped from a boutique in San Francisco. She'd shown them to Emily weeks before, excited, proud. Emily had barely looked at them. Now those shoes stood at the edge of the pier, catching the moonlight, as Karen stared out at the water. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were fixed on something only she could see. Behind her, the party continued without pause. No one seemed to notice her absence. No one seemed to care. At 11:13 p.m., a guest, later identified as Margaret Lowe, a family friend, noticed Karen walking back toward the house. She remembered thinking Karen looked tired, maybe a little drunk. She didn't think much of it. At 11:27 p.m., a waiter named Jesse Morales saw Karen near the dock, speaking with Emily. Their voices were low, but the tension between them was unmistakable. Jesse hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Then he heard glass shatter. At 11:34 p.m., he glanced back toward the pier. Karen was standing with her arms crossed. Emily was walking away, her heels crunching over broken glass. A thin line of blood ran down Emily's left hand. By midnight, Karen Wilson was gone. Her shoes, those burgundy heels, size 7, were found on the pier the next morning, placed neatly side by side as if she'd stepped out of them and walked straight into the water. Her purse was in her car. Her keys were in the ignition. Her cigarette, half-smoked, floated in the shallows. And on the weathered planks of the dock, just beneath where Jesse had seen the two women standing, was a dark stain the color of rust. The official report called it an accidental drowning. The Clackamas County Sheriff's Department conducted a brief investigation, interviewed a handful of witnesses, and concluded that Karen Wilson, likely intoxicated, had slipped on the wet dock and fallen into the lake. The absence of a body was explained as probable displacement due to lake currents and underwater vegetation. The case was closed in 5 days. Michael Hayes, Karen's husband and Emily's stepfather, held a small memorial service. Emily and Daniel returned from their honeymoon early to attend. Life moved on, but 28 years later, when a dog walker named Sandra Ortiz stumbled upon a fragment of bone in the woods 15 miles from Lake Hayden, the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit would reopen the file. And what they found, locked in strands of DNA, frozen in 5 seconds of VHS tape, and hidden in a closet where a pair of burgundy heels had been kept for nearly 3 decades, would shatter every assumption the Wilson family had built their lives upon. Because Karen Wilson didn't drown that night. She was murdered, and the person who killed her had been standing right beside her, holding a bottle of champagne, a secret she would bury for nearly 3 decades, and a pair of shoes she could never bring herself to throw away. Chapter 1. The Perfect Day. August 19th, 1995, 9:47 p.m. The wedding had been perfect. Too perfect. Emily Wilson stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching her new husband spin an elderly aunt, Daniel's great-aunt Judith, across the polished wood. The jazz band, a quartet she'd hired from downtown Portland, played something slow and sweet, the kind of tune that made people sway without thinking. Around her, guests laughed and clinked glasses, their faces flushed with wine and the humid warmth of the August night. But Emily wasn't smiling. She stood rigid, her fingers wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute she hadn't touched in over an hour. Her eyes tracked across the room, moving from face to face until they landed on her mother. Karen Wilson sat alone at the head table, her back to the dance floor. She'd been there for the past 20 minutes, staring at something, or nothing, in particular. Her plate was untouched, the salmon and asparagus congealing under the dim light of the paper lanterns. Every so often someone would approach to offer congratulations or compliments, and Karen would smile, tight, polite, distant, before turning back to her silence. Emily knew that look. She'd seen it 100 times growing up. It was the look Karen wore when she was deciding whether to say something or let it go. It was the look that meant she knew something and was weighing the cost of keeping quiet. "Em, you okay?" Emily flinched. Daniel had appeared beside her, his tie loosened, his face glowing with happiness. He kissed her temple, and she smelled the faint sweetness of bourbon on his breath. "Yeah," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just taking it all in." Daniel grinned, his dimples deepening. "Best night of our lives, right?" "Right." He squeezed her hand and disappeared back into the crowd, already being pulled toward the bar by one of his college friends. Emily watched him go, then turned her gaze back to her mother. Karen was looking directly at her now. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment neither of them moved. It was a silent conversation, the kind mothers and daughters can have without words. And in that brief exchange, Emily felt her stomach twist into a knot, because she knew. She knew what was coming. Karen stood slowly, smoothed the wrinkles from her burgundy dress, and walked toward the French doors that led out to the lake. Her heels clicked against the hardwood, a deliberate, measured sound that somehow cut through the music and laughter. Emily set down her glass and followed. August 19th, 1995, 10:02 p.m. The air outside was cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The music from inside was muffled here, reduced to a distant hum beneath the sound of cicadas and the rhythmic lapping of water against the dock. Emily stepped onto the wooden pier, her heels clicking softly against the planks, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Karen stood at the far end, her back to the house, a cigarette glowing between her fingers. She didn't smoke often, only when she was stressed or angry, or both. "You're smoking again," Emily said, her voice tight. Karen didn't turn. "Only on special occasions." Emily crossed her arms, the silk of her dress rustling. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Mom." Karen exhaled a long stream of smoke, then flicked the cigarette into the water. It hissed as it hit the surface, the ember dying instantly. She turned slowly, her face half-shadowed by the moonlight, her expression unreadable. "You lied to me," she said quietly. Emily's pulse quickened. "About what?" "The trust fund." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and cold. Emily felt her face flush, but she forced her voice to stay level. "I don't know what you're talking about." Karen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Don't do that. Don't insult me." She stepped closer, her heels scraping against the worn wood of the dock. The string lights from the house cast flickering shadows across her face, making her look older, harder. "I spoke with Mr. Henderson yesterday," Karen continued, her voice steady but cold. "He was very confused about Grandma Lillian's signature on the distribution letter. Said it didn't match the samples he had on file." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands were shaking, but she clenched them into fists, willing herself to stay calm. "Mom, I can explain." "You forged a letter," Karen said, cutting her off. "You forged my mother's signature to access money that wasn't yours. Money that was supposed to be split between you, your brother, and the Alzheimer's charity. And you took it all. $30,000. I needed it. For what? This?" Karen gestured back toward the house, where the party glowed warm and golden through the windows. "A wedding you couldn't afford? A life you're pretending to live?" Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." But Emily couldn't. Because the truth, that she'd been drowning in credit card debt, that Daniel didn't know, that she'd been terrified of losing him if he found out she wasn't the successful, independent woman he thought she was too humiliating to say out loud. It was too raw, too shameful. So instead, she said, "It's my life, my choice." Karen stared at her, and for the first time, Emily saw something crack in her mother's expression. Not anger, disappointment. "I raised you better than this," Karen said softly. Emily felt her throat tighten. "I don't need a lecture. Not tonight." "No," Karen agreed. "You need consequences." Emily's blood went cold. "What does that mean?" Karen didn't answer right away. She just looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and Emily saw something shift in her mother's eyes. Something final. "I'm calling Mr. Henderson Monday morning," Karen said. "I'm reporting what you did. You'll have to pay it back. All of it. And if you can't—" She trailed off, her meaning clear. Emily's vision blurred. "You wouldn't." "Watch me." The words hit like a slap. Emily took a step forward, her voice shaking with a mix of rage and desperation. "You do that, and you'll ruin everything. Daniel, my career, my life." "You did that yourself." Something inside Emily snapped. She lunged for the champagne bottle sitting on the dock table, a half-empty Moet someone had left behind after a toast, and swung it toward the railing. The glass exploded against the wood, shards scattering across the pier like sharp green stars. The sound echoed across the water, sharp and violent in the stillness. A jagged piece sliced into Emily's palm. She gasped, blood welling instantly, dark and thick. Karen didn't flinch. She just stood there, her face calm. Too calm. "Are you finished?" she asked. Emily stood there, breathing hard, the jagged neck of the broken bottle still clutched in her uninjured hand. Her left palm throbbed, blood dripping onto the weathered planks. Her mother's face was impossible to read. No fear, no anger, just a kind of resigned disappointment that made Emily feel like a child again. "I'm done talking to you," Emily spat, her voice trembling. She turned and stormed back toward the house, her heels crunching over broken glass. Behind her, Karen stood alone on the pier, staring out at the water, her arms crossed against the night chill. Emily made it halfway up the path before she stopped. She stood there, breathing hard, blood still dripping from her hand. Inside, the party continued. Music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Daniel's voice rose above the others, telling some story that made everyone laugh. Her perfect life, her perfect lie, and her mother was going to destroy it all. Emily turned around and walked back to the pier. August 19th, 1995, 11:41 p.m. What happened next would be reconstructed later, pieced together from forensic evidence, witness statements, and 5 seconds of grainy VHS footage. Emily returned to the pier. Karen turned, surprised to see her daughter back. "I need you to understand," Emily said, her voice low. "I can't let you do this." Karen's expression softened slightly. "Emily, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to help you understand that actions have— I know about Dad." Karen froze. "I know why he left," Emily continued, taking a step closer. "I know about the money he took from his firm. I know you covered for him, lied to the partners, forged documents to make it look like an accounting error." Karen's face went white. "That's different, is it? He was my husband, and I'm your daughter." The words came out as a scream. Emily's voice cracked, raw with years of resentment. "You protected him. You lied for him. But me? You're ready to destroy me over $30,000? Karen took a breath, steadying herself. "What your father did nearly destroyed our family. I won't watch you make the same mistakes." "Then don't watch." Emily raised the broken bottle. Karen stepped back, her hand flying up defensively. "Emily, don't—" The jagged glass caught her palm, slicing deep. Blood welled instantly, dark and thick. Karen cried out, stumbling backward. Her heel, that beautiful burgundy heel, caught on a loose plank. She fell. Her head struck the edge of the dock with a sickening crack. And then she was still. Emily stood frozen, staring down at her mother's crumpled body. Blood pooled beneath Karen's head, seeping between the weathered planks and dripping into the black water below. Her eyes were open, glassy, staring at nothing. One shoe had come off in the fall, lying on its side near the edge of the pier. For a long moment, Emily didn't move, couldn't move. Then, slowly, she knelt beside her mother and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. No pulse. Emily's mind went blank. Not with panic, but with a cold, crystalline clarity. She looked back toward the house. The party was still going. Music, laughter. No one had noticed. No one had heard. She had minutes, maybe less. She moved quickly. First, she wrapped her bleeding hand in her mother's scarf, stemming the flow. Then she carefully removed Karen's other shoe and placed both heels neatly at the end of the pier. An accident, a fall, a drowning. Second, she took the broken bottle and threw it into the lake as far as she could. It disappeared into the darkness with barely a splash. Third, she wiped the blood from her hands using fallen leaves from the edge of the dock, then scattered them into the water. The body would have to wait. She couldn't move it far. Not tonight. Not with 200 guests 30 yards away. But she had a plan. She always had a plan. Emily stood, smoothed her dress, and walked back toward the house. As she reached the patio, she slipped into the bathroom through a side door, cleaned the cut on her palm, and wrapped it in gauze from the first aid kit beneath the sink. She changed out of her wedding dress, now spotted with blood, into the going-away outfit she'd planned to wear later. A simple cream pantsuit. No one would question it. Then she rejoined the party. "There you are." Daniel found her near the dessert table. "I've been looking everywhere. Where'd you go?" Emily smiled. "Just needed a minute. Big day." He kissed her forehead. "The biggest. I love you." "I love you too." And she meant it. Even as her mother's body lay cooling on the pier 50 feet away. August 20th, 1995, 3:17 a.m. The party ended just after midnight. The last guests straggled out by 12:45. Daniel, exhausted and drunk, collapsed into bed by 1:30. Emily waited. She lay beside him, listening to his breathing deepen, counting the seconds until she was sure he was asleep. At 2:47, she slipped out of bed and dressed in dark clothes, jeans, a black hoodie, sneakers. She went to the garage and found the tarp Michael kept folded on a shelf. She took the camping shovel from the rack on the wall, and she took her mother's car keys from the hook by the door. It took her 20 minutes to drag Karen's body from the pier to the Volvo. Her mother was heavier than she looked, dead weight. Emily's arms shook with the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wrapped the body in the tarp and placed it in the trunk. Then she drove. She took Highway 213 south, away from the city, into the dark woods near Molalla. She knew these roads. She'd explored them as a teenager, hiking the trails, finding quiet spots where no one ever went. She parked at the trailhead and dragged her mother's body 50 yards into the forest to a clearing surrounded by ferns and moss-covered logs. The ground was soft, loamy. It took less than an hour to dig a shallow grave. When she was finished, she stood over the grave, breathing hard, her hands blistered and caked with dirt. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She just thought about the shoes. Those burgundy heels sitting neatly on the pier. She'd have to go back for them eventually. Emily filled in the grave, smoothed the dirt, scattered leaves and branches over the top. By the time she was done, it looked like nothing had ever been there. She drove back to Lake Hayden, parked the Volvo exactly where it had been, and burned her clothes in the fireplace. She showered, scrubbing the dirt from beneath her fingernails, washing her hair twice. Then she climbed back into bed beside her husband. When Michael discovered Karen missing at 6:14 a.m., Emily was the first to call the police. Chapter 2. The Search. August 20th, 1995, 6:14 a.m. Michael Hayes woke to an empty bed and a gnawing sense of unease. He reached for Karen's side of the mattress. Cold. He sat up, blinking in the early morning light that streamed through the curtains, and glanced at the clock. Just after 6. Karen was an early riser, but not this early. Not after a wedding. Frowning, he pulled on a t-shirt and padded downstairs, barefoot. The house was quiet, eerily so after the chaos of the night before. Empty champagne bottles lined the kitchen counter. Half-eaten cake sat on the dining table. The air smelled faintly of cigarettes and perfume. "Karen?" No answer. He checked the living room, the study, the back porch. Nothing. Then he saw the car. Karen's silver Volvo sat in the driveway, exactly where she'd parked it the night before. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her keys were in the ignition. Michael's chest tightened. He walked toward the lake, his pace quickening. The pier came into view, and that's when he saw them. Karen's shoes. Those burgundy heels placed neatly side by side at the edge of the dock, as if she'd stepped out of them and walked straight into the water. "Karen!" He ran to the end of the pier, scanning the lake. The surface was glassy and still, reflecting the pale morning sky. No ripples, no movement. "Karen!" His voice echoed across the water and disappeared into the trees. Nothing. August 20th, 1995, 7:03 a.m. By the time the Clackamas County Sheriff's Department arrived, a small crowd had gathered. Guests who'd stayed overnight, neighbors from down the road, a jogger who'd heard Michael shouting. Deputy Lucas Kane was the first responder. He was young, maybe 27, with a military buzz cut and a nervous habit of flipping his notebook open and closed. "When did you last see your wife, Mr. Hayes?" Michael stood on the pier, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Last night, around 11:30, maybe midnight. She said she needed some air. I went to bed. I thought she'd come up later, but—" He trailed off, staring at the shoes. Kane jotted something down. "Was she drinking?" "A little. A few glasses of wine. Nothing unusual." "Did she seem upset?" Michael hesitated. "She'd been quiet all night, distant, but I figured it was just stress from the wedding." Kane nodded slowly. "Anyone else see her after you went upstairs?" Before Michael could answer, a voice spoke up from behind them. "I did." Both men turned. Emily stood at the edge of the pier, dressed in a simple white t-shirt and jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. On her left palm was a small bandage. "I talked to her," Emily said quietly. "Around 11, out here." Kane's pen paused mid-note. "What did you talk about?" Emily's gaze flicked to the shoes, then back to Kane. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Wedding stuff. She was stressed. I told her to get some rest." "Did she seem upset?" "A little, but she was fine when I left. I went back inside, cut my hand on a broken glass." She held up her bandaged palm as proof. Kane studied her for a moment, then wrote something in his notebook. "Okay, we'll need a formal statement later, but for now, we're treating this as a possible drowning. We'll have divers out here by noon." Michael exhaled shakily. "Do you think— is there a chance she's still—" "We'll do everything we can, sir." But Kane's tone suggested he didn't believe Karen Wilson was still alive. August 20th, 1995, 11:47 a.m. The dive team arrived just before noon. 2 men in wetsuits and a woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as Sergeant Linda Cross. She was in her mid-40s, stocky and no-nonsense, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun. "Lake's not too deep here," she said, scanning the water with a practiced eye. 15, maybe 20 feet. If she went in, we'll find her." Michael stood on the shore, watching as the divers slipped beneath the surface, their movements slow and methodical. Emily sat on a bench near the house, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Daniel sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, whispering words of comfort she didn't seem to hear. The search lasted 4 hours. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no signs of struggle, just a cigarette butt floating near the pier and a dark stain on the wood that Cross initially dismissed as wine. By late afternoon, Cross pulled Michael aside, her expression somber. "Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you something." Michael's face was gray with exhaustion. "Anything." "Does your wife have any reason to leave? Family issues, financial trouble, anything like that?" Michael blinked. "Leave? You think she ran away?" "I'm not saying that. I'm just trying to understand the full picture." Michael shook his head firmly. "Karen wouldn't do that. She wouldn't just disappear. We were planning a trip to Italy next month. She was excited." "She wouldn't—" His voice broke. Cross nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Okay, we'll keep searching. But I have to be honest with you, if she's not in the lake and there's no sign of foul play, this might turn into a missing persons case pretty quick." Michael stared at her. "Foul play?" "Just covering all bases, sir." but the words hung in the air long after Cross walked away. August 23, 1995, 2:14 p.m. 3 days later, the case was officially classified as accidental drowning. The final report, signed by Deputy Kane and reviewed by the Clackamas County coroner, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, concluded that Karen Wilson had likely slipped while walking on the wet pier, fallen into the water, and drowned. The absence of a body was explained as probable displacement due to lake currents and underwater vegetation. The dark stain on the pier was tested and determined to be wine. The case was closed pending the recovery of remains. Michael didn't believe it, but Emily said nothing at all. The memorial service was held on August 27th, a small, quiet affair attended by family and close friends. There was no casket, just a framed photo of Karen smiling in a garden somewhere, and a wreath of white lilies that filled the church with their heavy, cloying scent. Emily stood at the front, dry-eyed, while Daniel held her hand. When the priest asked if anyone wanted to say a few words, Emily stood and walked to the podium. "My mother," she began, her voice steady, "was a woman of principles. She believed in honesty, in fairness, in doing what was right, even when it was hard." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled mourners. "She taught me that actions have consequences, that we're defined by our choices, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing." Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. "I'll miss her every day." And then she sat down. No one noticed the way her jaw tightened when she looked at the photo. No one saw the flicker of something, guilt, relief, that crossed her face. When the service ended, Emily walked out of the church without looking back. That night, while Daniel slept, Emily went to the closet in their guest room and opened a box she'd hidden on the top shelf. Inside were her mother's burgundy heels. She'd gone back to the pier the morning after the police left, when no one was watching. She'd taken them, wrapped them in tissue paper, and hidden them away. She couldn't say why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a reminder. Maybe it was insurance. She placed the box back on the shelf and closed the closet door. She never opened it again. Chapter 3. The years between 1996-2010. Building a Life on Silence. In the months following Karen's disappearance, life moved on with a momentum that felt both inevitable and surreal. Michael sold the Lake Hayden estate in early 1996. He couldn't bear to look at the water anymore, couldn't sleep in a house where his wife's ghost seemed to linger in every room. He moved to Seattle, remarried in 1998. A quiet courthouse ceremony with a woman named Diane who worked in real estate and died of a sudden heart attack in 2005. He was 63. At his funeral, Emily stood beside Diane and spoke briefly about the man who'd raised her from the age of 12. She said he was kind. She said he was devoted to her mother. She said she would miss him. She didn't cry. But later, when everyone had left and she was alone in the parking lot, she sat in her car and stared at her hands. The scar on her left palm, from the broken bottle, was still visible, a thin white line that caught the light. She wondered if Michael had known, if he'd suspected. She wondered if he'd died, still believing in her. Emily and Daniel stayed in Portland. They bought a house in the West Hills, a modern craftsman with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city below. They had 2 daughters, Sophie, born in 1997, and Claire, born in 2000. On paper, their life was perfect. Daniel worked as an architect. Emily went to law school, graduated near the top of her class, and took a job at a nonprofit legal clinic specializing in domestic violence cases. She was good at it, better than good. She won cases that seemed unwinnable, restraining orders for women whose abusers had connections, custody battles for mothers the system had failed. She was sharp, relentless, empathetic. She knew how to talk to women who'd been hurt, how to earn their trust, how to make them believe that justice was possible. "You saved my life," one client told her after a particularly brutal case. Emily smiled and said, "That's what I'm here for." But at night, when Daniel and the girls were asleep, Emily would lie awake and stare at the ceiling, her mind replaying that night on the pier. The sound of glass breaking, the look on her mother's face, the weight of the body as she dragged it into the woods. She never told anyone, not Daniel, not a therapist, not a priest. She carried it alone. August 19th, 2003, 8 years later, every year, on the anniversary of her mother's disappearance, Emily would drive out to Lake Hayden. She never told Daniel where she was going. She'd make up an excuse, errands, a meeting, a friend in need, and she'd drive the 45 minutes to the lake, park on the side of the road, and sit in her car for exactly 10 minutes. She wouldn't get out. She wouldn't walk to the pier. She'd just sit there, staring at the water, letting the memories wash over her. On the 8th anniversary, it rained. A cold, relentless drizzle that turned the dirt road muddy and obscured the view of the lake. Emily sat in her car with the windows cracked, listening to the rain drum against the roof. She thought about her mother, about the woman Karen had been, strong, principled, uncompromising. She thought about the fight they'd had, the things they'd said. She thought about the moment Karen's head had hit the dock, the sound, the stillness. Emily closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But she wasn't sure if she meant it. She thought about the shoes, still hidden in the closet at home. She'd moved them twice over the years, once when they packed for the new house, once when Sophie had started getting curious about what was on the high shelves. The shoes were her anchor, her reminder, her secret. She started the car and drove home. 2015, the crack in the facade. By 2015, Emily was a senior attorney at one of Portland's most respected legal aid organizations. She'd been featured in Oregon Monthly as a voice for the voiceless. She gave talks at law schools, she mentored young attorneys, but at home things were starting to fracture. Daniel had grown distant. The girls were teenagers, wrapped up in their own lives. Sophie at college in Seattle, Claire preparing for her senior year of high school. Emily worked late, took cases she didn't need to take, stayed at the office long after everyone else had gone home. One night in October, Daniel confronted her. "You're never here," he said. They were in the kitchen, the remnants of a half-eaten dinner between them. Claire was upstairs with headphones on. The house felt cavernous, empty. "Even when you're here, you're not really here." Emily looked up from her laptop. "I have a deposition tomorrow." "You always have something tomorrow." Daniel's voice was tight, controlled. "Emily, I feel like I'm living with a stranger." She closed the laptop slowly. "What do you want me to say, Daniel?" "I want you to talk to me. I want to know what's going on in your head. You've been like this for years, distant, closed off, and I don't know how to reach you anymore." Emily stared at him, and for a moment she almost told him, almost let the words spill out. "I killed my mother. I've been living with it for 20 years. I don't know how to stop carrying it." But instead she said, "I'm fine, just stressed." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're not fine, Em, and I don't know what to do about it anymore." He left the kitchen. Emily sat there alone, listening to his footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the bedroom door closing. She picked up her phone and stared at the screen, not really seeing it. Then she opened the closet in the guest room and looked at the box on the top shelf. The shoes were still there. She didn't take them out. She just stood there, looking at the box, feeling the weight of 20 years pressing down on her chest. Then she closed the door and went to bed. They didn't talk about it again. 2020 A pandemic and a reckoning. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020, and the world ground to a halt. Emily worked from home. Claire attended her freshman year of college online from her childhood bedroom. Daniel spent his days on Zoom calls in the converted garage. For the first time in years, they were all under the same roof, with nowhere to go and nothing to distract them. Emily found it suffocating. She started going for drives. Long, aimless drives through empty streets, past shuttered businesses and deserted parks. She'd tell Daniel she needed to clear her head, and he'd nod without looking up from his laptop. One afternoon in May, she found herself heading toward Lake Hayden. She didn't plan it. Her hands just turned the wheel in that direction, pulled by some invisible thread. When she arrived, she was surprised to find the old Wilson estate still standing. It had been converted into a bed and breakfast. Lake Hayden Inn, painted a cheerful yellow with bright blue shutters. A sign out front advertised weddings and events. The irony wasn't lost on her. Emily parked and walked down to the pier. It looked smaller than she remembered. The wood was weathered, some of the planks replaced, but the structure was the same. She stood at the end, where her mother's shoes had been found, and looked out at the water. It was quiet, peaceful. For a moment she considered it, calling the police, confessing, ending the lie she'd been living for 25 years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Where are you?" Emily took a deep breath, turned around, and walked back to her car. She never went back to Lake Hayden again. Chapter 4. The Cold Case. May 2023. The call, Clara Morgan, had been with the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit for 11 years. She was 43, divorced, no kids, and lived alone in a small apartment in Salem with a cat named Roscoe and a growing collection of true crime podcasts she listened to while running. She was good at her job, methodical, patient, stubborn to a fault. She had a reputation for solving cases that had been gathering dust for decades. On a Tuesday morning in May, her phone rang. "Detective Morgan? This is Officer Ryan Webb, Clackamas County. We've got something you might want to see." Clara leaned back in her chair, cradling the phone against her shoulder. "I'm listening." "Dog walker found a bone fragment out near Molalla, about 15 miles from Lake Hayden. Looks human. We ran it through the system, got a hit on a 1995 missing persons case. Karen Wilson." Clara sat up. "Karen Wilson. The drowning?" "That's the one. Except the bone wasn't in the lake, it was buried in the woods." Clara was quiet for a moment, her mind already working through the implications. "Send me everything you've got," she said. May 15th, 2023. Oregon State Police Forensics Lab. The bone fragment was small, maybe 3 inches long, yellowed with age, still partially encased in dirt. It had been found by a woman named Sandra Ortiz, who'd been walking her golden retriever near a popular hiking trail. The dog had dug it up, thinking it was a stick. Dr. Amelia Tran, the forensic anthropologist, examined it under a magnifying lamp, her expression focused. "Definitely human," she confirmed. "Looks like part of a rib. Female, based on the density and cortical thickness. I'd estimate mid-50s at time of death." Clara stood across the table, arms crossed. "Can you get DNA?" "Already sent a sample to the lab. Should have results in about a week." "And cause of death?" Tran adjusted the lamp, tilting the bone to catch the light. "Hard to say from one fragment, but—" She pointed to a hairline crack running along the edge. "See that? That's not post-mortem damage. That's a fracture that occurred around the time of death. Blunt force trauma to the head, most likely." Clara's jaw tightened. "So she didn't drown?" "Not if this is her. No." May 22nd, 2023. DNA results. The DNA came back on a Monday morning. Clara was at her desk, sipping lukewarm coffee and reviewing the original 1995 case file when her phone buzzed. It was a text from the forensics lab. "Call me. It's important." She dialed immediately. "Detective Morgan," the lab technician said, "we have a positive match. Mitochondrial DNA confirms the bone fragment belongs to Karen Wilson." Clara exhaled slowly. "You're sure?" 100%. But there's more." "What?" "We also ran the DNA from the dock stain, the one that was labeled as wine in the original report. Turns out it wasn't wine. It's blood. Type A positive." Clara frowned. "Karen's type?" "No, Karen was O negative, but we ran it through CODIS and got a familial match. Mother-daughter relationship." Clara went very still. "Emily." "Bingo. And there's one more thing. We found trace amounts of Karen's blood on fabric fibers collected from the original scene. Looks like they were caught on a nail near the pier. The fibers match a type of tarp commonly sold at hardware stores in the 90s. Clara hung up and stared at the case file on her desk. A photograph of Emily Wilson, taken at her mother's memorial service in 1995, stared back at her. She looked young, sad, innocent. Clara picked up the phone again. "I need a warrant," she said. Chapter 5. The Video, June 5th, 2023. Before making an arrest, Clara wanted to be absolutely sure. She drove to the Clackamas County Storage Facility, a cavernous warehouse filled with boxes of old evidence, case files, and forgotten relics of crimes past. She was looking for one thing: the wedding video. It took 3 hours of searching through dusty shelves before she found it. A single VHS tape in a plastic evidence bag labeled Wilson Hayes Wedding, 8/19/95. Back at the station, Clara called in a favor from the tech department. They managed to locate a working VCR, a relic itself, and set it up in the conference room. Clara popped in the tape. The footage flickered to life. Grainy, shaky, a woman in white spinning on a dance floor, laughter, toasts, the jazz band playing in the background. Clara fast-forwarded through the first hour, scanning for anything useful. Then, at the 11:22 p.m. timestamp, the camera panned outside. And there they were, Karen and Emily standing on the pier. The audio was faint, muffled by wind and distance, but Clara could just make out fragments of their conversation. Karen's voice, sharp. "Henderson, signature." Emily, defensive. "Don't understand." Then the camera jolted. Someone bumped the tripod, and when it steadied again, the frame had shifted slightly. Now Clara could see Emily's hand. She was holding something, a champagne bottle. Clara watched as Emily raised the bottle and swung it toward the table. The glass exploded. Karen stepped back, hands raised. Emily stood there, breathing hard, the broken bottle still clutched in her fist. A thin line of blood ran down her left palm. Then the screen went black. Clara rewound the tape and played it again. This time she paused on a single frame. Emily, standing on the pier, the jagged neck of the bottle in her hand, blood dripping onto the weathered planks. And in the background, barely visible in the shadows, a burgundy heel lying on its side near the railing. Clara picked up her phone. "I need a search warrant," she said. "Emily Wilson's residence, and an arrest warrant. Charge, murder in the second degree. June 10th, 2023. The search. The search warrant was executed on a Saturday morning. Clara and 3 officers arrived at Emily's house in the West Hills at 8:47 a.m. Daniel answered the door, confused and alarmed. Emily wasn't home. She'd gone for a run, he said. "We have a warrant to search the premises," Clara said, handing him the paperwork. Daniel read it, his face going pale. "This is about Karen? But that was 30 years ago." "New evidence," Clara said simply. "Please step aside." They searched methodically. Bedroom, kitchen, garage, attic. Clara was looking for one thing in particular, and she had a hunch where to find it: the guest room closet. She climbed onto a chair and pulled down boxes from the top shelf. The third box, wrapped in old tissue paper covered in dust, felt different. She opened it. Inside were a pair of burgundy heels, Italian leather, size 7, the same shoes that had been found on the pier in 1995. Except these shoes had never been logged as evidence, because Emily had taken them. Clara carefully photographed the shoes, then placed them in an evidence bag. "Got it," she said into her radio. Chapter 6. The Arrest. June 12, 2023, 7:14 a.m. Emily Wilson was drinking coffee in her kitchen, scrolling through emails on her laptop, when the doorbell rang. She frowned. It was early. Daniel had already left for work, and the girls, both in their 20s now, Sophie living in Seattle, Claire in grad school in California, wouldn't be visiting unannounced. She set down her mug and walked to the front door, expecting a delivery. Instead, she found Clara Morgan and 2 uniformed officers standing on her porch. "Emily Wilson?" Emily's polite smile faded. "Yes?" Clara held up her badge. "I'm Detective Clara Morgan, Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit. I need you to come with us." Emily's face went pale. "What? Why?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Karen Wilson." For a moment, Emily didn't move. She just stood there, staring at Clara, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and something else. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. Then the coffee mug she'd been holding slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, sending a spray of dark liquid across the tile. I don't understand," Emily whispered. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." As Clara read her Miranda rights, Emily's knees buckled. One of the officers caught her by the arm, steadying her. "My daughters," Emily said, her voice breaking. "They can't know. Please, they can't." "Mr. Hayes has been notified," Clara said. "He'll make arrangements." They led Emily out to the patrol car, her hands cuffed in front of her. As they drove away, Emily turned and looked back at her house, the house she'd built her life in, the life she'd constructed so carefully over 28 years. It was all falling apart, and deep down, she'd always known it would. June 12, 2023, 10:32 a.m. Interrogation Room, Oregon State Police. Emily sat across from Clara in a small, windowless room. She'd been read her rights. She'd called her lawyer, a criminal defense attorney named Marcus Liu, one of the best in Portland. He sat beside her now, his expression unreadable. Clara opened a file and slid a photo across the table. The bone fragment. "We found your mother," Clara said quietly. Emily stared at the photo. Her face was blank, but her hands trembled. Clara slid another photo across. The VHS still, Emily holding the broken bottle. "We have the video. We have the DNA. We have your blood on the pier." Emily's lawyer leaned forward. "Detective, unless you have something concrete—" "We do," Clara interrupted. She pulled out a third photo, the burgundy heels. "We found these in your closet, your mother's shoes, the same shoes that were supposedly left on the pier the night she disappeared, except you took them. You kept them for 28 years. Emily's jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the shoes. "Why did you keep them, Emily?" Clara asked softly. Silence. Clara leaned forward. "I think you kept them because part of you wanted to be caught. Part of you wanted this to end, because living with it, carrying that secret for nearly 3 decades, it's been killing you, hasn't it?" Emily's hands were shaking now. She looked at her lawyer, then back at Clara. "It was an accident," she whispered. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm. "Emily, don't—" "She was going to ruin my life," Emily said, her voice cracking. "Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built. I just wanted her to stop. I didn't mean to—" She stopped, her breath hitching. "She fell," Emily whispered, "and then she was just gone, and I couldn't bring her back, so I buried her." Clara sat back. "Where?" Emily closed her eyes. "The woods, near Molalla. There's a trail off Highway 211, about 50 yards in. I thought no one would ever find her." Clara nodded slowly. "Emily Wilson, you're being charged with murder in the 2nd degree. You'll be transferred to the Multnomah County Jail pending trial." As the officers led Emily out, she looked back at Clara one last time. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Emily asked. Clara waited. "She was right, about everything. I did ruin my own life. Just took 28 years to prove it." Chapter 7. The Trial. September 2024. Multnomah County Courthouse. The trial of Emily Wilson became a media sensation. "Lawyer who defended victims accused of killing her own mother." The headlines were everywhere. National news, cable networks, podcasts, true crime forums. People who'd never heard of Karen Wilson suddenly had passionate opinions about her daughter. The courthouse steps were packed every morning with reporters, cameramen, protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for Karen" and "Innocent until proven guilty." Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Rachel Hale, built their case methodically. They presented the DNA evidence first. Dr. Tran took the stand and explained in careful detail how the bone fragment had been matched to Karen Wilson, how the blood on the pier belonged to Emily, how the fibers from the tarp were consistent with burial. They presented the video. The courtroom watched in silence as the grainy footage played on a large screen. Karen and Emily arguing, the bottle shattering, Emily's hand bleeding, the shoe lying on its side. When the video ended, you could hear people breathing. Then they called Jesse Morales. Jesse was 53 now, graying at the temples, wearing a suit that looked borrowed. He walked to the witness stand slowly, his eyes darting toward Emily, who sat at the defense table staring straight ahead. "Mr. Morales," Rachel Hale began, "can you tell the court what you witnessed on the night of August 19th, 1995? Jesse cleared his throat. "I was working as a waiter at the Wilson wedding. Around 11:30 I was clearing tables near the lakeside patio when I heard voices. 2 women arguing. Could you hear what they were saying? Not clearly, but I could tell it was heated. Then I heard glass break. I looked toward the pier and saw the bride, Emily, holding a broken bottle. Her hand was bleeding. The other woman, her mother, was standing a few feet away with her hands up, like she was trying to calm her down." "What happened next?" "Emily walked away, back toward the house. The mother stayed on the pier for a minute, then I went back inside. I didn't think much of it at the time. Weddings get emotional, you know. But the next morning, when I heard the mother was missing," he trailed off. "I told the police what I saw, but they didn't seem interested." "Why do you think that was?" Jesse looked down at his hands. "I don't know. Maybe they thought it was just a family argument. Maybe they didn't want to ruin the bride's wedding. I don't know. But I've thought about it every day since. Because if I'd said more, if I'd insisted—" His voice broke. Rachel Hale let the silence stretch. "Thank you, Mr. Morales," she said quietly. The defense tried to paint Emily as a woman under immense pressure, a woman who made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. Marcus Liu called character witnesses, colleagues from the legal clinic, former clients whose lives Emily had changed, a law professor who testified that Emily was one of the most dedicated students she'd ever taught. "This is a woman who spent her career fighting for justice," Liu argued in his closing statement, "a woman who dedicated her life to helping others. And yes, she made a terrible, irreversible mistake. But this was not premeditated murder. This was a tragic accident that spiraled out of control." But Rachel Hale was relentless. "The defendant had 28 years to come forward," she said, pacing in front of the jury box. 28 years to tell the truth. Instead, she buried her mother in the woods, staged a drowning, and built a life on a lie. She kept her mother's shoes as trophies. She visited the scene of the crime every year like some kind of pilgrimage. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated cover-up by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She paused, letting her words sink in. Karen Wilson deserved justice, and her family, her husband, her grandchildren, they deserved the truth. Emily Wilson took that from them. For 28 years, she let them believe a lie. That's not an accident. That's not panic. That's cold, deliberate cruelty. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On October 3, 2024, at 2:47 p.m., they returned with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood. "In the case of the state of Oregon versus Emily Claire Wilson on the charge of murder in the second degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." Emily's face didn't change. She just closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. Behind her, Daniel sat in the gallery, his face buried in his hands. Their daughters weren't there. They'd refused to come. October 15, 2024. Sentencing, Judge Margaret Choi sentenced Emily Wilson to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20. "This court recognizes that you have done good work in your life," Judge Choi said, her voice measured. "You have helped people. You have fought for justice for others. But justice is not selective, Ms. Wilson. You took a life. You buried the truth for nearly 3 decades. You let your family, your stepfather, your husband, your daughters live with a lie. And for that, you must be held accountable." Emily stood, her hands cuffed, her face blank. "Do you have anything to say?" the judge asked. Emily was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice steady but hollow. "I loved my mother, and I destroyed her. I destroyed myself. I'm sorry. To my daughters, to my husband, to everyone I hurt, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have left to give." She sat down. The courtroom was silent. The deputies led her away. Chapter 8. The Daughter. October 20th, 2024. Multnomah County Jail. Sophie Wilson Hayes sat in her car outside the Multnomah County Jail, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. She'd been sitting there for 43 minutes. She was 26 now, a graduate student in social work at the University of Washington. She looked like her mother, same dark hair, same sharp cheekbones, but her eyes were different, softer, less guarded. She'd driven down from Seattle that morning, telling herself she was ready, telling herself she could do this. But now, sitting here, staring at the gray concrete building, she wasn't so sure. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister Claire. "Did you go in?" Sophie didn't answer. Instead, she thought about the last time she'd seen her mother. It was the day of the arrest, June 12th. Sophie had been visiting from Seattle, staying at a friend's place in Portland. Her dad had called her at 9 a.m., voice shaking, saying the police had taken Emily. Sophie had driven straight to the house. By the time she got there, it was swarming with police, yellow tape, evidence bags, neighbors whispering, and her father sitting on the front steps, looking 10 years older than he had the day before. "What happened?" Sophie had asked. Daniel had looked at her with eyes that were empty, hollow. "Your mother killed your grandmother." Sophie remembered the feeling, like the ground had opened up beneath her, like everything she'd ever known had been a lie, because it had been. Her whole life she'd grown up hearing about Grandma Karen, the woman who'd disappeared, the tragic accident, the shoes on the pier. But it was all a lie. Her mother had killed her grandmother on her own wedding day, and then built a life, a family, a career, a reputation on top of that lie. Sophie had spent the past 4 months in therapy, trying to process it, trying to reconcile the mother she thought she knew with the woman who'd been convicted of murder. She still couldn't. Her phone buzzed again. "Claire, you don't have to do this." Sophie stared at the message. Then she opened her car door and stepped out. She walked to the jail entrance, gave her name at the desk, went through security. The visiting room was sterile, cold, plastic chairs, scuffed linoleum floors, a row of glass partitions separating visitors from inmates. Sophie checked in, stated her name, and was directed to Station 7. She sat down and waited. 5 minutes later, a door on the other side of the glass opened, and Emily walked in. She looked smaller than Sophie remembered, thinner. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, wearing an orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame. But it was her eyes that shocked Sophie the most. They looked hollow, empty, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that had made her mother her. Emily sat down slowly. She picked up the phone on her side of the glass. Sophie stared at her for a long moment, then picked up her own phone. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "You came." Sophie's throat was tight. "I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you." Silence again, the kind that stretched and ached. "Claire won't talk to me," Emily said quietly. "She blocked my number, changed her email. I don't blame her either." Sophie looked down at her hands. "She's angry. And you?" Sophie met her mother's eyes. "I don't know what I am." Emily nodded, like she'd expected that answer. "Your father? He's managing, barely. He sold the house, moved to a condo downtown. He doesn't talk about you." "Good." Sophie felt a surge of anger. "Good? That's what you have to say?" Emily's face crumpled slightly. "Sophie, I don't know what you want me to say. I'm sorry doesn't cut it. I know that. Nothing I say will ever—" "Then why did you do it?" The words burst out of Sophie, louder than she intended. "Why did you keep those shoes? Why did you go back to the lake every year? If you felt so guilty, why didn't you just confess?" Emily was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was a coward." Sophie waited. "I kept the shoes because I couldn't let her go," Emily continued. "I went to the lake because I needed to remember, to punish myself." "But confessing?" She shook her head. "That would have meant losing everything. You, Claire, your father, my career. And I couldn't do it. So I just kept living the lie, year after year, until it became who I was." Tears streamed down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. "I know you can't forgive me," Emily said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to know. Everything I did for you, every moment we had together, that was real. My love for you was real. It was the only real thing in my life." Sophie felt her own tears coming. She fought them back. "You killed your mother, my grandmother, a woman I never got to meet because you buried her in the woods and lied about it for my entire life. I know. You built our family on a lie. I know." Sophie's voice cracked. "How am I supposed to live with that? How am I supposed to move forward knowing that everything I thought I knew about you was fake?" Emily pressed her hand against the glass. "It wasn't fake, Sophie. I was a terrible person who did a terrible thing. But I was also your mother, and I loved you more than anything in this world." Sophie stared at her mother's hand against the glass. She didn't reach out to touch it. Instead, she stood up. "I have to go," Sophie said. Emily nodded, her hand still pressed against the glass. "Will you come back?" Sophie looked at her mother one last time, at the woman who'd raised her, taught her to ride a bike, helped her with her homework, sat with her through breakups and disappointments. The woman who'd also killed her own mother and buried the truth for nearly 30 years. "I don't know," Sophie said honestly, and then she hung up the phone and walked away. Emily sat there alone, her hand still against the glass, watching her daughter disappear through the door. When the guard came to take her back to her cell, Emily stood slowly, shoulders slumped, looking every one of her 55 years. In her cell that night, Emily lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Karen, about the shoes, about the 28 years she'd spent running from the truth. And she thought about her daughters, who would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile the mother they'd loved with the woman who'd been convicted of murder. She'd destroyed so many lives, starting with her own. Epilogue. The Lake. November 2024. Clara Morgan stood on the pier at Lake Hayden, watching the late autumn sun set over the water. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and wet leaves. The trees surrounding the lake had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, their reflections shimmering on the glassy surface. It had been nearly 30 years since Karen Wilson disappeared from this spot. 30 years of silence, of buried secrets, of a daughter living with the weight of what she'd done. Justice had come, but it had come late, and it had left wreckage in its wake. Clara thought about Emily, about the life she'd built on a lie, about the career she'd devoted to helping others while carrying the guilt of what she'd done. She thought about Sophie and Claire, 2 young women who would spend years unpacking the trauma of learning their mother was a killer. She thought about Daniel, who'd lost his wife twice, once to a lie and once to the truth. And she thought about Karen, whose body had finally been laid to rest beside her own mother's grave in a cemetery outside Portland. The headstone was simple, elegant. Karen Elizabeth Wilson, 1943-1995. Beloved mother, daughter, friend. Clara heard footsteps behind her and turned. Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the pier, hands in his pockets, looking older and more worn than when she'd first interviewed him months ago. He walked toward her slowly, his gaze fixed on the water. "Detective," he said quietly. "Mr. Hayes, I wasn't expecting to see you here." Daniel stopped beside her, looking out at the lake. "I needed to see it, the place where it all happened, where my life, our lives, fell apart." Clara nodded. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. "Do you think she ever loved me?" Daniel asked suddenly. "Really loved me? Or was I just part of the lie?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I think she loved you as much as she was capable of loving anyone while carrying that secret. But I also think that secret poisoned everything. It's hard to be fully present in a relationship when you're hiding something that big." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The girls won't talk to her. Sophie went to see her once, but she hasn't been back. Claire refuses to even say her name." "That's their choice," Clara said gently. "They get to decide what forgiveness looks like, if it looks like anything at all." "And what about me?" Daniel's voice cracked. "What am I supposed to do? I spent 29 years with a woman I thought I knew. We built a life together, raised 2 daughters, and it was all built on—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "A lie," Clara finished for him. "But that doesn't mean the good moments weren't real. The love you felt, the life you built together. Those things existed, even if they were built on a foundation of deception. You get to decide what to do with that. You get to decide whether to hold on to the good memories or let the truth destroy everything." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know if I can forgive her. I don't even know if I want to." "That's fair," Clara said. "Forgiveness isn't required. It's not even always possible. But at some point, for your own sake, you might need to find a way to let go of the anger. Not for her, for you." Daniel nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a faded photograph. He handed it to Clara. It was a picture from the wedding, August 19th, 1995. Emily and Daniel on the dance floor, her head resting on his shoulder, both of them smiling. Behind them, barely visible in the background, was Karen, standing alone near the French doors, watching her daughter with an expression that was hard to read. Pride, maybe, or sadness, or both. "This was taken an hour before it happened," Daniel said. "I found it when I was packing up the house. I keep looking at it, trying to see something, some sign that everything was about to fall apart. But I can't. All I see is two people who looked happy." Clara studied the photo. Maybe that's all there was in that moment. Two people who were happy, even if it couldn't last. Daniel took the photo back and stared at it for another moment. Then he walked to the edge of the pier, the exact spot where Karen's shoes had been found, and tore the photo in half. He dropped both pieces into the water. They floated on the surface for a moment, then slowly began to sink. "I need to let go," Daniel said quietly. "I can't carry this anymore." Clara put a hand on his shoulder. "That's a good start." Daniel turned and walked back toward the parking lot. Clara watched him go, then turned back to the water. The sun had fully set now, leaving the lake dark and still. Somewhere beneath the surface, the torn photograph drifted downward, joining the secrets the lake had kept for so long. Clara thought about all the cases she'd worked over the years, all the families torn apart by violence and lies, all the people who'd spent decades living with guilt or grief or both. Justice mattered. Truth mattered. But they didn't heal everything. Sometimes they just opened old wounds and forced people to learn how to live with the scars. Clara took one last look at the pier, then turned and walked back to her car. As she drove away, the Lake Hayden Inn glowed warm and golden in the distance, lights twinkling in the windows. Inside, a new wedding was being planned. New vows would be spoken, new promises made, and life would go on, because it always did, even when the past refused to stay buried. 1 year later, October 2025, the Multnomah County Correctional Facility visiting room was the same as it had always been, sterile, cold, filled with the quiet murmur of difficult conversations. Sophie Wilson Hayes sat at Station 7, phone in hand, waiting. She'd been coming once a month for the past 6 months. Not because she'd forgiven her mother, she wasn't sure she ever would, but because her therapist had suggested it might help her process the trauma. And because, despite everything, part of her still missed the woman her mother had been before the truth came out. Or maybe the woman she'd thought her mother was. She was still figuring that out. The door opened, and Emily walked in. She looked different, healthier somehow. She'd gained a little weight. Her hair was cut shorter. There was color in her cheeks, but her eyes still carried that same hollow look, the one that said she was living but not quite alive. Emily sat down and picked up the phone. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "Hi, Mom." They talked for 30 minutes. About small things: Sophie's classes, Emily's job in the prison library, the book club Emily had joined. They didn't talk about Karen. They didn't talk about the trial. They didn't talk about Claire, who still refused all contact. They just talked, like a mother and daughter, like people trying to find their way back to something resembling normal, even though they both knew normal was gone forever. When the 30 minutes were up and the guard signaled that visiting hours were over, Sophie stood to leave. "Sophie?" Emily said. Sophie paused, phone still to her ear. "Thank you," Emily said, tears in her eyes, "for coming, for giving me this. I know I don't deserve it." Sophie looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said, "You're right. You don't. But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me, because I need to figure out how to move forward, and I can't do that if I'm carrying around all this anger." Emily nodded. "That's fair." Sophie hesitated, then said, "I'm not sure I'll ever forgive you, but I'm trying to understand, and maybe that's enough for now." "It's more than enough," Emily whispered. Sophie hung up the phone and walked away. Behind the glass, Emily watched her daughter leave, one hand pressed against the partition, and for the first time in 30 years she felt something other than guilt. Hope. Maybe. Final scene: The Shoes. November 2025, Forest Grove Cemetery, Portland. On a cold, overcast morning in early November, Clara Morgan stood in front of Karen Wilson's grave, holding a small box wrapped in tissue paper. It had been 18 months since Emily's conviction, 18 months since the case had been officially closed. But there was one last thing Clara needed to do. She opened the box. Inside were a pair of burgundy heels, Italian leather, size 7, the same shoes that had been found on the pier 28 years ago. The same shoes Emily had kept hidden in her closet for nearly 3 decades. After the trial, the shoes had been logged as evidence, but the case was closed now, and Clara had requested permission to return them to Karen's grave, because shoes weren't evidence anymore. They were a memorial. Clara knelt down and placed the shoes gently at the base of the headstone, arranging them neatly side by side, just as they'd been found on the pier all those years ago. "I'm sorry it took so long," Clara said quietly, "but you can rest now. The truth is out. Your family knows what happened, and Emily. Emily is paying for what she did." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of rain. Clara stood and looked at the headstone one last time. Karen Elizabeth Wilson, 1943-1995. Beloved mother, daughter, friend. The truth will set you free. Clara turned and walked back to her car. Behind her, the burgundy heels sat gleaming in the pale morning light. Finally, home. The end.